Greetings, fellow mathematicians. Let's talk about fractions and decimals. In the first 3 years of school, children learn about fractions additively. They fold a shape in half. They'd look for gaps and overlaps as they superimpose the halves, and they describe it as half as big as whatever they started with. When they investigate quarters, they find that they can fold their half in half again to make a quarter. In this way, thinking additively, they could say that a quarter plus another quarter is a half, or starting to think multiplicatively, they can describe their quarter as half as big as a half. Now, children are going to find halves of shapes and halves of groups. Relating their halves of groups to halves of shapes is going to make it much more easy to understand. So they could start by halving a shape and then place half of their counters onto each half of their shape. What fraction of the counters is here? What fraction of the counters is here? What is half of our group? The same with quarters. They could fold their shape into quarters by halving a half. They could then place a quarter of their counters onto each quarter of their shape and again ask what fraction of the counters is here, what is a quarter of whatever their number was. Now, a word about the symbols. The symbols for a half and a quarter did not come until quite a few centuries after the concept of a half. So we want children to have deep understanding of a half and a quarter before they see the symbol. Introducing the symbol with the numerator and the denominator too early makes children see a fraction as two numbers. We don't want them to see two numbers. We want them to have the concept of a half and the concept of a quarter. We definitely don't want to say that a half is 1 out of 2. First of all, that's saying that the line between the 1 and the 2 in the fraction symbol says out of. It doesn't. It's a vinculum, and as children find out in round about year 5, the vinculum means divided by. So for two reasons we don't want to tell children that a half means 1 out of 2 is because number one, the fraction doesn't say that, and number two, we don't have to have both parts. I can tell you that this is half of what I own. The other half doesn't have to be here. You don't have to see the other half, but you can tell how much I own by knowing that this is half of it. So we don't want to tell children that a half is 1 out of 2 or 1 over 2, and we don't want to tell them that a quarter is 1 out of 4 or 1 over 4. We want them just to have a concept of what is a half and what is a quarter. Okay, moving on to year 3 to year 6. This is where the deep understanding of fractions really picks up. Children are going to learn about fractions multiplicatively in the same way as they learnt about multiplication and division multiplicatively. So they're going to look for multiplicative relationships between fractions by building a fraction wall. So when they put their halves on their fraction wall, a half is a half of 1. That's a multiplicative relationship. When they put their quarters on their fraction wall, a quarter is a quarter of 1, and a quarter is half of a half. When they put their eighths on their fraction wall, an eighth is an eighth of 1, an eighth is half of a quarter, and an eighth is a quarter of a half. Now they start to investigate the meaning of the denominator at the same time as they're dividing by 2, dividing by 4 in multiplication and division. They find that when they divide by 2, they end up with a half. The denominator in a half is 2. That denominator is telling us what number we divided by. We look at the meaning of the numerator. So on the fraction wall we might have 2 quarters. The fraction 2 quarters is telling us, first of all, the denominator is telling us that we divided by 2, and the numerator is telling us that we have 2 of those parts. We then move on to, in year 4, we start to extend multiplicative place value to include fractions. Now, tenths and hundredths as decimals didn't come along until about 3,000 or 4,000 years later, after fractions were started to be used. So we have the fraction using the symbol, the numerator and the denominator, and then round about 500 years ago we started recording fractions using place value. So we have two ways to record fractions, and that's why there are two, because by the time 500 years ago, the maths and the science that people wanted to do could not be done with fractions being recorded using a numerator and a denominator, because you couldn't get accurate enough fractions. Not every number can be recorded like that. So when tenths and hundredths were invented, by dividing 1 by 10 to get tenths, dividing the tenth by 10 to get hundredths, more on this in the place value concept. We then have two ways to record fractions, as fractions and as decimals. Children then start to investigate the meaning of the vinculum, which, as I mentioned before, means divided by. So the fraction 1/2 is 1 divided by 2, which is a half. The fraction 2/3 is 2 divided by 3, which is 2/3. Children investigate this at the same time as they're investigating dividing remainders in division to end up with a fraction. So if their remainder is 1 and they've been dividing by 2, they'll divide 1 by 2 and get a half. So rather than just putting your remainder on top of whatever you're dividing by, children will actually divide their remainder by what they're dividing by, and this will help them to understand the meaning of the vinculum in the fraction. Fractions in their simplest form are created using the highest common factor. So by dividing the numerator and the denominator by their highest common factor, which is a concept that children investigate in multiplication and division, means that they're going to get the fraction in its simplest form. Now, often when we do, for example, write, say, 4/8, we want that in its simplest form. We can divide the 4 by 4 and we can divide the 8 by 4, because the highest common factor of 4 and 8 is 4. Now what's missing is we don't put the vinculum in when we're dividing by the 4. So if we're dividing the 4 by 4 and the 8 by 4, we put the vinculum in, we can see that we're dividing by 4 quarters. When you divide by 4 quarters, 4 quarters using equivalent fractions is equal to 1. So when we divide the numerator and the denominator by the same number, we're dividing by 1. That's why we get an equivalent fraction, and that's why the fractions are the same size, because when you divide by 1 you get the same number. We also investigate division as multiplication by a fraction in multiplication and division, and we're also going to start to add and subtract fractions and decimals.